This is Eva Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm extremely excited to be here today with yoga teacher, author, and yoga therapist, Doug Keller. Doug is a lifelong student of yoga, and he has extensive training in all the major styles of yoga. But above that, I would say Doug has really developed his own approach to yoga teaching. As we see it here at YogaUOnline, Doug is one of yoga's quintessential philosopher sages. And Doug, I'm not saying that to butter you up. He combines a very, very deep grounding in yoga philosophy and practice with an incredibly rich and diverse study of Western anatomy and physiology. And as such, we experience again and again how Doug is really forging new paths in excellence in yoga teaching and practice, and guiding us all into a deeper understanding of the wonderful practice of yoga, both from the perspective of ancient yogic wisdom and modern science. So Doug, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here with you. Hi, everybody.
So we're here to talk about the vagus nerve, which has sort of become like the new darling buzzword of the yoga community and all sorts of movement circles. And I kind of was chuckling as I was preparing for the interview, because Tom Myers always referred to this psoas muscle as sort of like the almighty psoas, because we used to bow down at the altar of the psoas to help with pretty much anything from back pain to posture improvement to trauma release. And it seems like the vagus nerve is giving the psoas a run for its money.
I think so. I mean, both the psoas and the vagus insinuate themselves into practically everything that we do. So it's sort of at the heart of so many things in our life. And it's funny that you say the vagus nerve is the new thing, because it's actually one of the oldest things too. I mean, the first awareness of the vagus nerve goes back to Roman times, where there was a surgeon who studied injuries to gladiators and started to understand from different injuries around the neck and the torso, and through dissections, he started to discover this nerve that kind of runs through the center of the body, and when it becomes injured, has so many manifestations. So knowledge of it has been around for a while. A lot of the ideas about the vagus nerve are settled science, or pretty much agreed to for a long period of time. And at the same time, it's new because there are new studies about how it works. This whole idea of the polyvagal theory that I'll be talking about, that was set forth by Stephen Porges, on the one hand is really stimulating. On the other hand, it's very controversial, because scientists are arguing back and forth about the theoretical validity of those ideas, whether it really matches up to the findings. But by the same token, what he's elucidating about the vagus nerve sheds so much light on so many permutations for our life, that I really feel like he's onto something, even if the science is not exact. And especially what I mean to do in the presentation is to lay out how much it helps to cast light upon very traditional ideas in yoga, particularly of the gunas and other aspects of ideas for self-care that we get through yoga. The vagus nerve helps us to understand that in connection with asana, alignment, pranayama, relaxation, as well as meditation. So even while the scientists still argue out the details about this polyvagal theory and some of the new thoughts about the vagus nerve, at the same time, it's a really useful idea that we can put to use in our yoga practice, just to bring a lot more clarity and a lot deeper experience to the practice. So I think it's kind of fascinating and inspiring, new and very old at the same time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And vagus, of course, means wandering, and it's the wandering nerve because it goes all the way from the cranial complex into the digestive organs. And that's why it's considered so important, because it touches so many aspects of bodily function. And we're used to the idea that when it comes to our muscles, we have to work to strengthen them. We have to work to keep our muscle flexible. And if we don't do that, we get stiff, we get pain issues, we increase our risk of falls and our independence as we get older. So the idea of muscle fitness is very well ingrained in our culture. But the idea of keeping a nerve strong, and I think you don't even use the word strong, that's a whole new concept. And can you really make a difference there?
Yeah, I think we're struggling to come up with language that works for understanding what the effect can be upon the vagus nerve that would be beneficial. And so people talk about toning the vagus nerve or strengthening. Of course, you don't strengthen a nerve like you strengthen a muscle, because a nerve doesn't work like a muscle. It's not a muscle. But by the same token, it has a deep influence upon the body. And just to give one example, I'll mention in the webinar that they are experimenting with different techniques of direct stimulation of the vagus nerve, especially electrical stimulation. And what they found, there's one doctor in particular I'll mention, has been working with inflammatory conditions and found that when you give small electrical stimulation to the vagus nerve, it helps with inflammatory conditions like Crohn's disease and other diseases like that having to do with the gut in particular. There's a very strong connection between the vagus nerve directly to the brainstem and the gut. And so it's possible to stimulate the vagus nerve artificially. They're trying that out in science with really promising and fascinating results. And of course, we can, through our breath and other practices, we can stimulate the vagus nerve in order to create shifts in the nervous system. Because what it hooks into is what's called the autonomic nervous system. The nerve originates at the brainstem rather than the brain itself. And so the nervous system is autonomic in the sense that it produces automatic responses in response to the stimuli that come to it through the vagus nerve. And so the shift from a parasympathetic state, a state of relaxation and homeostasis, into a sympathetic state, which is the fight or flight state, that's the kind of switch that we kick into through the feedback from the vagus nerve. And this is actually translated through the secretion of different hormones that bring about different results in the body to meet stress. So when we're faced with a dangerous situation or stress, even stress at work or the stress of not getting enough sleep, other forms of stress, the body starts to produce hormones, especially like adrenaline, cortisol. It kind of de-emphasizes some systems of the body, such as your digestive system. So when you're under stress, you often lose your appetite because basically the hormones decrease the activity of the digestive system to divert energy to what you need to focus on in order to handle the stressful situation. Then we're meant to switch back from that state to a parasympathetic state. So the stimulation comes through the communication, by way of the communication through the vagus nerve, which affects our hormonal system. And of course, if we're under a long period of stress, we sort of have an overload effect from those hormones, especially cortisol. We know that has effects on the body, like putting on stress weight. So this, traditionally, we think of sympathetic, parasympathetic in connection with the autonomic nervous system as sort of an almost reflexive or automatic response. And a lot of the research going into this system now on the vagus nerve, especially from Stephen Porges and his work on the vagus nerve, is starting to see how we can exert more control over that response than we thought. And in interesting ways, I think this concept of this automatic response goes all the way back to the Bhagavad Gita and the discussion of the gunas, where Arjuna is asking Krishna, why are we fighting this war when we know better? I mean, what is it that's forcing us or impelling us to fight this war when everybody would rather not? And Krishna says it's simply the gunas acting upon the gunas. And he's suggesting the same sort of automatic response of being kicked into a sympathetic state or fight or flight, over which we have almost no control. And so he calls it rajas, We can call it the vagus nerve or the different hormones associated with that. But the question was, how do you deal with a response that seems almost reflexive or automatic? How do you regulate that response? And Porges talks about it in terms of self-regulation. How can you catch yourself in the moment of switching over into a different aspect of your nervous system and actually put the brakes on that or reverse it or moderate it to some degree? That was the same discussion in the Bhagavad Gita about yoga, as how do you deal with these automatic responses of what they called the gunas in a way that you can respond to the situation instead of simply reacting to the situation. It's really the same, largely the same discussions, both back in the Bhagavad Gita and today. And what I'd like to look at in the webinar is what are some of the basic tools of yoga that we have that we can put to use in order to readjust our nervous system to a more sattvic state, to a more parasympathetic state, to a relaxed state of homeostasis through the breath, and also recognizing how much the very alignment of the body, what we do with our neck, what happens in the muscles around the neck, as well as the diaphragm and the other muscles associated with the bandhas, when those muscles are not functioning properly, when the body's out of alignment, that has an effect upon the vagus nerve that can get us stuck in certain states of the nervous system that perhaps we would rather not be in. So how can we understand these tools of the bandhas, basic alignment, basic diaphragmatic breath, to bring about a shift so we can choose the state that we would like to be in, a more sattvic state, rather than finding ourselves defaulting into other states that are not so constructive for us. And especially when we switch into other states like a sympathetic state, it's meant to be a temporary situation. We go into a sympathetic state and we're meant to come out of it again. But sometimes, especially when we're facing more long-term forms of stress, it's kind of hard to shift out of that modality back into a relaxed state. So I want to look at the tools of yoga for engaging our practice in a way that helps us to come back to the sattvic, the parasympathetic state as being the more default state of our being, and giving us some measure of self-regulation or self-control, or what's really the essence of what yoga is about, which is dealing with being embodied and dealing with the mind and emotions in the most constructive and productive way.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and of course, what you're talking about, to use another buzzword, is hacking the nervous system. And this idea that there are techniques that you can use. We're all kind of familiar with the experience of trying to force yourself to relax, right? Once you're stuck in that sympathetic mode of functioning, it's very hard to snap out of it. So this idea that working with, I guess, essentially toning the vagus nerve can have an effect both in the short term, but also longer term, right? You can actually create a situation where the basic tone of the vagus nerve is such that you become more resilient to stress in the first place.
Yeah, I think, well, vagus nerve as the wanderer provides the connection of both what's called interoception, which means being in contact or being in touch with what's going on inside. And this gives us access to certain intuitive levels of intelligence. For instance, they found in a study of investors in Wall Street that investors who are actually in touch with their own heartbeat or can perceive or be aware of the rate of their own heartbeat actually make better decisions in investments than people who don't have that same degree of interoception. So interoception through the vagus nerve and the connection it makes between the mind and the body gives us access to deeper levels of intelligence. And with that also comes nociception, which is our perception of danger, which in an evolutionary sense is really useful. If we pick up on the cues of danger and react appropriately, we're better able to survive. The problem in our culture now is we develop a faulty sense of nociception and we perceive danger where there is none. That's part of the root of PTSD and victims of trauma, that events become triggers because they're perceiving danger based upon a memory of a previous trauma. They perceive danger in the present situation, which is not there, which throws them into the state of hypervigilance. And the idea of toning the vagus nerve is really about establishing a firm connection of interoception and also an accurate degree of how well you perceive the relative safety or dangers involved in the environment. And I think a new aspect of this as I study it is to understand the shifts that take place in the body come not just from the vagus nerve, but from the stimulation of the secretion of hormones, as I mentioned before, things like adrenaline and cortisol that bring about these organic shifts in the body that put us into a different state. We can also, through qualities of our yoga practice, stimulate the production of our feel-good hormones like dopamine. And I'll talk about aspects of our practice that we can use to support the stimulation of those feel-good hormones to shift us back into a parasympathetic state. This is important for pain management because it helps us to gate our pain or deal with pain impulses and change our pain threshold. And at first, when this is like endorphins. For instance, if you're experiencing aches and pains in the body and you get some exercise, the body produces endorphins and basically gates the pain or blocks it. So you don't feel the aches and pains so much and you're feeling good. In the beginning, that may be a little bit of a Band-Aid on the pain or a little bit of a mask of the pain. But as you follow your practice and become more accustomed to being in that state, then it shifts your pain threshold and shifts your relationship to the body in such a way that you don't feel the chronic pain as much. And chronic pain comes up when there's not necessarily actual damage to the body that we need to pay attention to. It's more the aches and pains that just kind of come up in the body, and the lower our pain threshold, the more we suffer from them. We can change our pain threshold and actually achieve a more constructive state in the body. I call them our abhyasa hormones. Through practice, we stimulate the production of these hormones, and then that puts us in right relationship to the endocrine system, as well as in right communication through the vagus nerve itself. And so we're able to literally, through our practice, establish sattva as our default way of being, whereas otherwise we might be stuck in a rajasic way of being, or in some cases even a tamasic state of being. All of these states depend upon the communication that's traveling through the vagus nerve in relationship to our breath, our heartbeat, and the overall state, inner state of the body. I'm not sure toning the vagus nerve is the right language. Rather, we're facilitating an open pathway of communication. So we have a better relationship between mind and body, between mind and heart, between mind and breath, which ultimately is what yoga practice is about, is establishing that communication as the first step in our spiritual growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you are drawing the parallel to the three gunas and the idea of sattvic functioning as one way to essentially communicate with the vagus nerve to create a trigger in how the nervous system functions. So before we end up, I know people are going to want to hear, do you have one example you can offer?
Well,
complicated. I know it is like a whole thing of many different factors, but if you were to say one thing that's your favorite go-to thing for regulating nervous system.
There are 2 points of direct connection to the vagus nerve or the cranial nerves in general. And the first is through the root of the palate, because the cranial nerves govern what's happening at the back of the throat, the muscles in the back of the throat, both in the act of swallowing, also with our gag reflex. If we eat food that's bad for us, it's actually the vagus nerve that acts upon the stomach, causing us to eject the food before it poisons us. It also governs the very movement of the voice box and the uvula for breath, swallowing, and all these basic functions. People with Parkinson's have problem with speaking and with swallowing because of the effect upon the cranial nerves from the situation of Parkinson's. Now, how you can stimulate a more optimal function of the vagus nerve is through the Ujjayi breath. The very alignment of the neck, which opens up the pathways of the nerves, and actually the stimulation of the muscles connected to the cranial nerves through producing the Ujjayi sound or the Ujjayi space of the breath. And so we're going to be looking at some of the basic features of the Ujjayi breath in relationship to the placement of the tongue, the configuration of the throat, and how we make a resonant breath in a way that both produces a subtle Ujjayi sound, but actually stimulates the vagus nerve to produce a more parasympathetic state. In connection with that, the cranial nerves also exit not only at the surface of the nostrils, but at the inside of the nostrils. So when you're doing alternate nostril breathing, you're actually, by feeling the flow of the breath through the nostrils, you're directly stimulating the cranial nerves once again, which does bring about shifts in the nervous system, as well as the secretion of different hormones that facilitate a more sattvic state. So we're going to look at a couple things in terms of the subtleties of the alignment of the neck, a soft form of Jalandhara Bandha, which facilitates the Ujjayi breath in the throat, and also look at how the use of alternate nostril breathing, when we do it in a much more perceptive, interoceptive fashion, paying attention to the sensation of the breath rather than just opening and closing nostrils and breathing through them, that facilitates a subtle shift inside, so you come to a place of greater balance. And this is even related to, because there are two separate pathways of the vagus nerve that run down through the neck, which kind of correspond to Ida and Pingala in a sort of metaphorical sense. In asana practice, when we do contralateral movement, in other words, things like twisting or doing different things with the two opposite sides of the body, which very often happens in poses, you're facilitating the union of the two hemispheres of the brain and the coordination between the two aspects or sides of the vagus nerve. Again, in yoga, they speak of it in terms of the union of the sun and the moon, or the moon and the sun, the left nostril and the right nostril. This is something that's facilitated through asana practice as well as breath. And this is also bringing about balance in the nervous system through the pathways of the vagus nerve. So yoga in and of itself is, and always has been, concerned with this aspect of the nervous system. It uses different language to describe it. So a lot of what we're doing in this webinar is to bring to conscious awareness or a better appreciation of what the basic practices of yoga are doing and how we can deepen those practices in a way that facilitates a better communication through the aspect of the vagus nerve.
That's beautiful. I love that. It's a great way of looking at it, and it also makes us appreciate how the finer aspects of our yoga practice make a big difference in rather than just doing it rote and going through the motions of it. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Doug. Really appreciate this great highlight of your upcoming course, and also in general, your great insights into this somewhat complicated topic, but you did a great job at really making it accessible. And we'll look forward to seeing you at your course.
Great. I'll look forward to it too.
All right. And everyone, thank you so much for listening in, and we'll see you later on YogaUOnline. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.